Without further ado, I would like to open our first session, which begins with a pre-recorded conversation between activist, scholar, and author Angela Davis and Manthia Diawara, professor at NYU and a filmmaker. The screening will be followed by a conversation between Manthia and Salah Hassan, director of the Africa Institute Sharjah and distinguished professor of arts and sciences at Cornell University.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Hur Al-Qasimi and Salah Hassan for organizing the March meeting and giving me the opportunity to see Professor Davis, Angela Davis, again. I was just visiting with her a couple of weeks ago. And we like to have this conversation themed on the concept of freedom, and then go from there to see what's going to happen. Because for me, and many people in the US and internationally, we view Angela Davis as the philosopher of our new century, you know, for the person who really defined ethics by looking at the action. So it's the ethic of the action that she's good at revealing to us in her philosophy. So I will begin right away by asking a question about freedom, knowing that you have spent, Professor Davis, your whole life fighting freedom, for freedom, not just freedom for African-American people, but freedom to really cover all the spaces. Wherever there is injustice, wherever there is oppression, you have been fighting to remove the oppressor, whether it is white supremacy or other forms of freedom. Can you tell us what is freedom to you?
That's a huge question. But perhaps I should begin by saying that I'm happy to participate remotely in the March meeting organized by the Sharjah Art Foundation. Thank you for the question, Manthia. I think I should begin by saying that the word freedom was probably one of the earliest words I learned as a child. And I think that word has always anchored my vocabularies, whether they be philosophical or activists. And I was thinking about the various ways in which freedom was evoked in the everyday lives of Black people growing up under conditions of segregation in the South, as I did in the late 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. Freedom was a word that was often pronounced, whether in spirituals, the Black spirituals, which were collectively sung in the church I attended. I remember, oh, freedom, before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. So I just wanted to begin with that introduction, but I suppose I should say that the concept of freedom has been utilized in ways that often militate against the very meaning of freedom. And I'm referring to those who use the term as reflective of the absolute right of individuals to do whatever they wish without being obstructed by the state or other individuals. The freedom, for example, not to wear masks during a pandemic. And I just want to point out that I have never thought about the meaning of freedom in such individualistic terms. Any meaningful notion of freedom, I think, should be collective in character. It is not the capacity of an isolated individual to pursue an individual project, regardless of the needs of others in the community, but rather, I think that I would suggest that freedom consists of the collective capacity of people in community to pursue social, political, economic, cultural projects that will help the entire community to flourish. And of course, historically, we've defined freedom in opposition to slavery. And I think we continue to understand freedom as what you might call the concrete negation of slavery. And slavery has existed in many cultures through many historical eras. But I think that it is the enslavement of people of African descent as the very foundation for economies in the Americas that not only helped to create the conditions for capitalism, but that called upon those who were enslaved to contest that condition. And I think that Black people's ongoing struggle for freedom has helped to define a more general quest for freedom during the modern era. And in many ways, one can argue that people of African descent have enlivened this concept, have modernized it, and have shaped the whole concept of freedom over the centuries. And I think that, I mean, I've always been very intrigued by, Hegel's notion of history as progress in the consciousness of freedom. And this is an era during which people all over the world are developing a new sense of what freedom might entail. And at the same time, we see a kind of push backwards. I'm thinking about the war that's happening in Ukraine at this moment. It almost feels as if we're being pushed back to the era of the Second World War. But I think that now more than ever, we have we should use that impulse to struggle for freedom as a way of acknowledging the globality of the meaning of freedom.
It's an incredible answer. I think it's brilliant in a sense that you got me thinking about enlightenment pushed by UK and France, and yet they had the biggest colonies in the world while they were pushing freedom and individual rights. So it is an amazing, amazing response.
And actually, I think we should, since you've made that point, we should always question why Haiti is not a part of that conversation, given that it was the second independent nation of the Americas, and given that Haiti produced actually the very first non-racial democracy.
Absolutely, yes, I think you're right. Reading CLR James on this is really absolutely brilliant. Another question that our team really pushed me to ask is that of the abolition of prisons, the prison industrial complex, and the way you tie to transnational capitalism. In the book, for example, are prisons obsolete? So the question is, what does it mean to talk about prison abolitionism, especially in the context of prison reform and prison education? What do you say to those who might argue that abolition prison is utopian or hard to materialize. I'm laughing at the question, but go ahead, please.
Well, yeah. I guess I would say that, yes, abolition is a utopian vision, and it is hard to materialize, but this doesn't mean that we can't initiate political and cultural trajectories that may ultimately lead in that direction. And, you know, I was thinking that the etymological meaning of utopia is no place. But no place does not mean no time. And abolition is precisely about imagining new futures, imagining possible futures. And in that context, I would say that people who were fighting for the abolition of slavery had collective ideas about a future in which slavery would no longer define the landscapes of our lives, the economic and social and political landscapes. And those of us who've been arguing for and struggling for the abolition of what we call the prison industrial complex, we also hold collective ideas about futures that are not grounded in vengeance and retribution, prison abolition, police abolition, including the abolition of border police and the police work that is at the heart of formations like child protective services. Abolition helps us to reconceptualize the very meaning of justice. And I think I want to thank you for including the links between the prison industrial complex and capitalism, because that's precisely why those of us who tried to popularize the term in the late 90s, that's precisely the reason why we decided to use that particular concept, which we borrowed from Mike Davis's term for a shifting economy in California, shifting from agribusiness to prisons. The notion of the prison industrial complex captures the fact that the prison economy has become a significant element of the larger economy, and that many corporations that one would never expect to be involved in the prison industry, like telecommunications, catering, privatized healthcare, et cetera, began in the 80s and the 90s to gravitate toward the prison industry. And now the prison industrial complex reflects those relationships, economic, political, cultural, that have not only been responsible for the permanence of the actual institution, but that also ideologically urge people to think of this institution as one that will have permanence in the future. But I think I also need to point out how the role of structural racism within the prison industry helps us to understand how racial capitalism functions. This is a term that we've been using pretty regularly, especially in relation to Cedric Robinson's analysis. Now, progressive and radical work, whether it is scholarly or cultural or activist, should acknowledge the integral relationship between what we call racist-inspired mass incarceration and the larger issues of radical social transformation. the point that I'm trying to make is that prisons and police cannot be abolished without restructuring the entire society, without a revolutionary vision. And it's not a question of myopically focusing on prisons or myopically focusing on the police, which is what those who are critical have a tendency to do, including Biden in his most recent State of the Union address, who responded to calls to defund the police by saying that we will give even more funds to the police. Excuse me. Now, like I said, it's not a question of focusing in an isolated way on these institutions, but rather it's a question of asking why this society relies on such violent institutions, why we cannot develop less brutal methods of assuring safety and security in our society. Prisons and police reproduce the very violence they pretend to address. So the real question is, how can we transform our worlds, our social, economic, political world, so that we don't need to rely on these institutions of violence? And so that will mean jobs. It means housing. It means healthcare. It means free healthcare, free physical healthcare, free mental healthcare. It means free education. It means deprivatization, decommodification of the services that we need to survive and flourish in our various social worlds. So abolition is about socialism. Abolition is about reconceptualizing the futures of this planet. And of course I could continue, but I think I'll stop there.
Well, reconceptualizing transformation. This is what I meant in the beginning when I said that you are the philosopher of our time, of this new century. I remember calling you one time.
I don't know about that, Manthia.
I am too. Because Angela, you and I did conferences in Florence, in Paris, in many places where you talk about the prison industrial complex, you talk about abolition. But at the end of every conference, people say to you, what do you think about Black Lives Matter? And this did not change at all until the George Floyd event. And then I called you, I said, Angela, see, you were right, you did this. You said, no. Let's not talk about that. We have popularized that concept, but now let's talk about new areas that we can popularize. And I think this is what you're saying here. I want to also talk about your book with Professor Gina Dent, just published on feminist abolitionism. What is feminism?
Yeah, well, the book is called Abolition Feminism Now. And there are 4 authors, Gina Dent, Beth Ritchie, Erica Miners, and myself. And it would be interesting to talk about the process of 4 people writing a single book, which is very, very difficult.
Yes.
But it was a collaborative. It was a collaborative approach in the same sense that we wanted to try to argue for collaborative intellectual work and collaborative activism. You asked me, what is feminism? But I don't know whether I would argue that feminism can be defined, it can be simply defined. I don't think there's a single definitive definition of feminism. As a matter of fact, there are multiple feminisms. I like to point out that I do not identify with what you might call glass ceiling feminism, what many of us back in the day called bourgeois white feminism. I think that my collaborators and I in this short book that we published, we're using an approach to feminism that is generally referred to as intersectional. That is to say that it is anti-racist, it is anti-capitalist, it is abolitionist, it is internationalist, and it is not primarily identitarian. It's more methodological. And just as I characterize the approach that we urge, the approach to feminism as intersectional, this intersectionality is not primarily around identity, but rather it is around struggle. It's about struggle, the intersectionality of struggles against race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, environmental issues, etc. You know, I'm thinking about the Combahee River Collective statement that was published in 1977 when they encouraged what they called an integrated analysis and practice, an integrated analysis and integrated practice based on what they referred to as interlocking systems of oppression. And they argued that the synthesis of these systems create the conditions of our lives. I think the members of the Combahee River Collective statement were very prescient in terms of the kind of feminism that would resonate widely in the 21st century. Abolition feminism insists that abolitionist theories and practices reflect this integrated analysis. And as abolition emerged during the contemporary approach to abolitionist theories and practice, which emerged during the latter half of the 20th century, this was inflected with feminism, but at the same time, it called forth certain kinds of resistance to prison abolition. And when I say the latter 20th century, I'm referring in particular to the aftermath of the Attica Rebellion. And some feminists, whom we might refer to as carceral feminists today, assume that the problem of gender violence could never be solved without using conventional elements of a carceral system, without having to rely on the police and prison. And so if one looks at the Violence Against Women Act, one sees that it is in the context of the Bill on Violent Crime, and the solutions include increasing numbers of police, etc. But let me see if I can figure out how to bring this back to the question you were asking. Because even at that time, some of us were pointing out the dangers of relying on carceral strategies. The same strategies that were used against the then increasing numbers of people behind bars. And let me give you an example, a case that I think resonates today, and that claimed wide support at the time. And that was the case of Joanne Little in North Carolina, who was charged with murder because she fought back against a white jailer who threatened her with a, if I remember correctly, it was a screwdriver while he raped her. And now, if there were those of us who argued that, yes, we have to challenge the sexual abuse of women, and especially Black women, and especially sexual abuse by white jailers and others in positions of power. But we said at the same time that if we don't also recognize the degree to which Black men were subject to the violence of racism through the racist use of the rape charge, we would not be pursuing the kind of practice that would target the structural character of racism. And let me tell you, in this particular case, some of us brought together this sexual assault on Joanne Little in a jail in North Carolina, together with the frame up of a young Black man in Florida, whose name was Delbert Tibbs, who had been falsely charged with raping a white woman in the same way as the Scottsboro Nine had been framed, and the same tradition as the justification of the lynching of Emmett Till. So that was, that was in the 1970s. That was, I think, around 1975, 1976. And we're still trying to make the same argument. And so in the book, we argue that abolition is most effective when it is feminist. That is to say, with an intersectional perspective. And we argue that feminism is most effective when it is abolitionist.
Abolitionist feminism, Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Miner, and Beth Ritchie. Yes. It's incredible. You also talk about young generation of men who are now feminist. What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't think that feminism is attached to gender identity. Because of course there are many people who identify as women who don't take feminism seriously. At the same time, there are people who identify as men, and of course people who identify as gender nonconforming as well, who find it very useful to use the conceptual framework and the methodological approach of anti-racist, anti-capitalist feminism. And I think this is true not only in the US, but in other parts of the world. I think increasingly in South Africa, increasingly in Brazil, and increasingly within movements against racism in Europe as well.
Yes, you have traveled widely in Africa and stated that you have learned a lot about feminism with African women. Can you say a little bit about movements and the places that you have been to in Africa? People like Nawal al-Saadawi, or the artist Ingenie Eflaton. Can you tell us a little bit about these experiences?
Well, yeah, I have, over the years, over the decades, spent some time in African countries, South Africa as well. I've made many trips to South Africa and have been very much impressed by the the theories and the practices of struggles against racism on there, especially because there has been a tendency, challenged recently, of course, in the aftermath of the police lynching of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and the recognition that Indigenous people and Black people and oppressed people everywhere are bearing the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think that South Africa is a place that allows us to understand the afterlives of apartheid, for example. I mean, I know that this gathering is considering the afterlives of post-colonialism, and we talk about the afterlives of slavery, but certainly the afterlives of apartheid are inscribed in the various institutional apparatuses, including the police. So what we try to reflect in the book, again, going back to Abolition Feminism, are the struggles and the campaigns unfolding in various parts of the world, including South Africa, where there are efforts to deal with the racist structures in police violence, even though the police are primarily Black now, and even though the actual individual agents are Black, but the inheritance of racism from the apartheid regime remain ensconced within the institutions. And I think that is a feminist approach. And of course, Palestine, I should mention how important it has been to make connections with people in the resistance in Palestine who will continue to challenge settler colonialism and who recognize the connections between racism in relation to the occupation of Palestine and racism in relation to police violence in the UK, in France, in the US. And I think that that we've learned a great deal from Palestine. And I'm thinking back to a meeting Layla Khaled, who has inspired feminist movements. I'm thinking about Sahar Francis, who was the head of the Adamir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association that's in Ramallah. And I'm also thinking about professors and intellectuals associated with such formations as women's studies in Bitset. And when I visited Palestine about a decade ago, I had the opportunity to spend time and was very impressed by the work that was happening there. But I would also have to evoke Brazil. Brazil is the country outside of Africa that has the largest concentration of African descended people in the world. And those of us who are in North America should be paying more attention to what is happening in South America, and especially in a place by Brazil, where the racist police violence is even more disturbing, and I don't like to create hierarchies of violence, but I think that especially given the response to the assassination of Marielle Franco,
Yes.
and the surge of Black women's movements in Brazil, including radical women getting elected to parliament. Erica Malinguinho, for example, who was a Black trans woman in Sao Paulo. So yeah, I think that here in the U.S. we are encouraged to act as if we exist as the center of the world. And that everybody is looking at us, but it is not our responsibility to find out what is happening in other places. And ever since I was very young, and probably ever since I learned how to be in solidarity with the Algerian Revolution, I've been attempting to encourage a kind of internationalism that makes our lives so much richer and our struggles so much stronger.
This is brilliant, because when I hear you talk about solidarity here, and if I can make you return to the US, the Black struggle you always say was not just Black people. You know, whether one is going to the Black Panther movement, to the Black Power movement, or even before, you go all the way back to Frederick Douglass. This solidarity that you're mentioning in South Africa, in Brazil, in Palestine, can you say a little more about this?
Well, yeah, you know, Black people in the US have been the beneficiaries of solidarities all over the world. And let's remember that the very first rebellions by enslaved Africans were enabled by indigenous people.
Yes.
So you know, whenever people talk as if it is possible to make any significant comments about the Black struggle by only referring to Black people, it disturbs me, because you know, it leads to what Betita Martinez called oppression Olympics. It leads, you know, to this notion that certain people are far more oppressed than others. And well, anyway, we can talk about that at a later time. But I think we can't forget that the very foundation of the Black liberation movement involves the assistance of indigenous people. And Kelly Lytle Hernandez has a new book called Bad Mexicans. And one of the points that she makes is that Mexican revolutionaries were very important allies to the Black struggle in the US. You know, I visited, well, the last time I went to Belfast a few years ago, I was really struck by the fact that people, this was in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter. And so they were reflecting once more on Frederick Douglass's visits to Ireland. And then, of course, we remember Ida B. Wells visited the UK and Ireland and found a great deal of support there for the anti-lynching movement. And so I think the point that I want to make is that precisely because of this internationalization of Black struggles. Black people in the US should be especially willing to offer solidarity to people involved in freedom struggles in other parts of the world. In Africa, of course, but also in the Philippines, in Brazil, in Europe, in Palestine. And I mean, I think I sound to myself like a broken record because I'm always making that point that we can't simply be the recipients of solidarity. We have to offer solidarity as well. But the point that you were making,
go ahead, please.
The point that you were making earlier is that the struggle for Black freedom was not a struggle of only Black people. That the women's movement in the U.S. emerged out of the anti-slavery movement. What we call the white feminist movement has its roots in the anti-slavery movement. And so I think this whole notion of the intersectionality of movements, of struggles is important to retain.
You know, Angela, Professor Davis.
You can call me Angela, you always do.
You, in the film I'm now making on you, you made a strong point about art, whether it is music, painting, or writing, reveal to us or to our consciousness spaces that we have not yet realized. If I were to put this in my own words, the theme of the Sharjah Biennale, number 15, is thinking historically in the present. And the March meeting in March 2022 is the afterlife of the post-colonial, thinking about past struggles and solidarity movements. And on your involvement with such movement, can you reflect on what should be done? This is the question that I'm reading here, but I preface it with, what do you say about art?
Well, you know, I think that thinking historically in the present is a really challenging theme. Because, and also the notion of the afterlives of the post-colonial. And it seems to me that both of these themes suggest that we should not become so attached to the present that we experience, that we fail to understand the dynamic and I might even say the dialectical production of the present, that we don't understand how this present has been produced by the past, but it's also constantly producing possible futures. So I'm really intrigued by this notion of thinking historically in the present. And I think that the lack of a historical consciousness in places influenced by capitalist ideologies is one of the major problems of our time. Because of course, capitalism relies on the assumption that we imagine the future in the very way we experience the present, and that the market will always be the paradigm, and profit will always be the measure of value. So I'm thankful for these themes that are challenging. And I think that especially at this moment, when in the US and throughout the world, people have been urged to think about the historical forces that are responsible for racism and prisons and police and the severe repression of immigrants. These are the afterlives of slavery and colonialism. And I think that that we're beginning to recognize that easy solutions won't work. The solutions to the ongoing problems of racism that have been proposed over the last decades are solutions that are bound to reproduce and replicate the very problems they presume to solve. Diversity, for example, what is it, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Every institution now has to have its office of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But such strategies prevent interesting and imaginative and creative approaches to the problems of racism. You were talking about art at the beginning of the question, and I think that it is so essential to take seriously the work that artists can do to help us to imagine that which we don't yet know. And I often like to point out that art can help us to feel what we have not yet figured out how to put into words. And my major mentor in philosophy, Herbert Marcuse, used to always point out that even though art may not create the social change that we want and need, it does not produce the revolution in an unmediated way, but it can change the people who then, in order to act on those feelings that art can produce, we will need to create revolution in the world. And so I think that this conference is exploring a whole range of really important issues. I'm so sorry that I'm unable to be there I'm unable to be there in person, but I will, follow the presentations and the panels that are being offered over the next period.
I'm also very happy. I think I always tell you my biggest cliche is that you take me to school each time, every time you give a talk. Today, what I'm taking home is this idea that African Americans have been the recipient of everybody's support. And it scares me that that's being used by a section of the community to form new tribalism, capitalist tribalism, basically, Black tribalism in the US, that some people may call Black embodiment or whatever word they used to call it. So you addressing that today in the way you address it, I'm really pleased. I'm also thankful to Kasimi for including us, not only in the March meeting, but also in the Biennale that's coming. And we will just be thrilled to welcome you to Sharjah in person. So I'm really happy about her courage and her team's diligence and the work that they're doing. Angela, thank you so much.
And thank you, Mancha. And have a good conference.
Thank you. And good seeing you. I know they're still recording this, but I'm so happy to see you. You look beautiful, Angela.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You look great yourself.
Thank
So
you.
this was recorded?
This is recorded. The engineer is in the room now, and then they will show it on the 7th. They will show it on the 7th. Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I look forward to seeing you real soon, Mancha.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Well, this is actually one of the few moments that I find myself in a very difficult position as a moderator, because this is supposed to be live, and then I serve as a moderator between Manthia and Angela Davis, which is now already, if you've heard it, so it made, I mean, what do I say? Both of you said it all, and especially Angela, just, it's overwhelming, you know, when you listen to her. What more can you say? As you said, that she schools us every time that we listen to her. So I will try to improvise, because it's very difficult to engage with you alone without her. But I'm sure you also have always taught me as a mentor, and I would like to say that, that I have known you since I was a student, when you just became a professor at Penn, and you have been a mentor and a great comrade. So what I will try to do is actually to engage the audience, because I think it is, you know, under the current circumstances, you've seen the dialogue, you've seen the conversation, and I'm sure many of you, so, you know, have questions. So my comments will be very, very, very brief, and that you really could just answer it in any way, you know. When I think about the conversation between the two of you, one thing that really remained consistent are two things. The notion that is that the freedom struggle, especially Black freedom struggle, that is shaped across the Middle Passage and challenge humanity on different levels. One, on the notion of freedom itself, and it challenged that notion of freedom that is shaped by the Enlightenment and the so-called modernity, or European modernity. And that came through the freedom struggles. So Haiti is one early example, and then the struggle of African American is a later example. Both of them challenge the notion of freedom in saying it cannot be a monopoly of Europe. You can't be enslaving population and talk about democracy, liberty, and brotherhood, and all of these notions as universal, while they were only a monopoly. For France, you can't keep plantations in Haiti and the Caribbean. For the British, you can't continue to exploit the sugar plantation everywhere, and then claim a democracy, which is, of course, when you think about the afterlives of slavery, it's resurfacing the notion of apartheid and segregation. In the US, of course, the two have learned from each other in terms of legalizing that kind of notion, but also philosophically, you know, shaping it. So when I think about the conversation, I think about two books. The Black Jacobins, but of course also recently as Susan Buckmore's reshaped it more in Hegel and Haiti and Hegel. So if you can just reflect more out of your conversation here of these two notions of how the Black freedom struggle challenged the notion of modernity and challenged the notion of freedom together.
Thank you, Salah. And let me see if I put this on. Thank you, Salah. I think that today is the 7th, and by the time we came to the 7th, many of the themes that Angela spoke about have been treated in this very conference, from the keynote by Gayatri to the talks on the environment and so on. Your question is important to me because Edward Gleason said that the West is a project, it's not a geography. And Gayatri was talking yesterday about getting out of these oppositional discourses because they reproduce the same structures that we are trying to defeat. So you see, so the West in that sense, I think the big struggle, you know, when you get Donald Trump going to Poland and asking them, do you want to lose your culture? He's thinking about the West as a geography. And the way the West, certain ideas that are supposed to have been developed in the West and taken out of the West, and the way they were taken out from C.L.R. James, Susan Bart Morris, Gertrude Spivak, Frantz Fanon. I mean, he can name names ad infinitum. But what disturbs people is the ways in which these ideas have now opened the world to a wider space. You know, the space that was open to the world was just the world seen by Europe, by France, by UK, who yet had the biggest colonies in the world. Now the world is bigger and bigger. And this humanity is being revealed is not comfortable to many of us. Yesterday the talks about neoliberalism, they were really interesting to me. But at the same time, I said to myself, neoliberalism is only one ideology that is engaging our consciousness today, that is exploiting us today. There are other ideologies around. There is the past, there is the present, there is the attempt to go into the future. And then when we have these confluences that, again, Edward Gleason liked to call the new Baroque. The new Baroque being this confluence between differences in time and space. But they have all taken place now together. The critique of neoliberalism is not enough. We have to figure out how to really open the door and criticize traditions, criticize fixed identities, and so on. So the work I was trying to do in this interview, I was really doing my best, because I had just spent a week with Angela Davis doing the project that the Sharjah Biennale had commissioned me to do. And so I didn't want to repeat all of them and make the project obsolete in some ways, but it was very difficult to interview Angela Davis. So that's really what I wanted to do. And I know I'm all over the place on this.
No, you're not, but you're supposed to keep that a secret.
Yeah.
The film, the project for the okay. But anyway, it's revealed, but it's not, nobody knows what you're going to produce at the end, so no worries. There will be always the element of surprise.
But it still be Angela,
Yeah.
so no matter, even if she repeat herself, it's Angela.
So one more question, then I will open. Actually, in this context, you are interviewing, Angela, but I want to actually throw a question to you, almost like interviewing you too, because Manthia produced 2 memoirs that are really wonderful to read, and I recommend them for everybody in this room, because for me, I can relate to them. As an African like him, crossed the Atlantic, not of course on the boat, but came as a privilege, as a scholarship to study in the United States as a graduate student. The first book is called In Search of Africa, and then the second book is called We Won't Budge. And I think both of them are great reflections on African journey in the United States, but it's also an African journey into the Africa America, and especially the Black freedom struggle and observing it, being part of it. And both of us, in a way, we went to the United States probably around the same time, are beneficial, of course, beneficiary of the Black freedom struggle. All the accomplishment of the civil rights that allowed us to enter into universities, to be in spaces that many Africans couldn't imagine to be in prior to the 60s. If you travel in the southern part of the United States, you will be on the back of the bus, and so forth. So, and I've always encouraged my own kids to think about that historically, is that if they happen to be in the US, that they have to always remember, prior to the 60s, they will be visibly discriminated against, and that what they are enjoying now is part of that kind of, part of the freedom struggle. thinking about this through your own experiences in Black studies and what you have mentioned, if you can just briefly outline some of the most, in thinking about Angela's interview, and I wanted you to think about that from the other side of coming into the US and being there for a while, shaping Black studies and being part of it.
Well, it's no confession. I've always wanted to be a Black American. I grew up in Mali, Francophone country. U.S. Embassy brings in Black musicians to Africa. That propaganda, Voice of America, some of you may know this. They send, because Soviet Union and Europe were challenging America on racism. In order to respond to this, Voice of America came, and they bring Black, from Duke Ellington to, I don't know, they all visited Africa. And Junior Wells come to Bamako, and I pretended that I could speak English. And I said, do you know James Brown? And all of Bamako say, oh, Manthia speaks perfect English. So that love, I wanted to be Black American because of what you described. But it's more important than that. It's because of those images of Angela Davis in French magazine, Paris Match, Muhammad Ali in Paris Match or another magazine, James Brown, of course. So as soon as I finished high school, I went to Paris. I didn't want to wait we were a socialist government. I didn't want another confession, that's not a confession. I didn't want to go with a scholarship to the Soviet Union because they were sending us to East Germany and to Moscow. Many of my friends and colleagues went there. So I went to Paris, and I thought I was really important. And French people made me realize that I was not so important. So it was at that point, I went to America through surrealism, really, because I used to go chasing women. I used to go to Shakespeare and Company in Paris. Some of you may know this place. It's a bookstore, Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and so on. So when I was there in the 1969, 1970, really, Ted Jones was the biggest reader there, a surrealist Black poet. And he will read, and I will wear my dashiki and keep shaking my head. And he thought that, well, he didn't think, because he was cleverer than I was in those days. So he basically said, this guy understood my poems. And everybody turned around, the Scandinavian women, all kind of stuff. They all turned and looked at me. And so I thought that I was really cool. But at that point, in months passed, Ted Jones told me, look, French people don't like you here. And Americans don't like us Black people there. You should go to America. And believe it or not, to make the long story short, Ted Jones gave me Jane Cortez's telephone number, Stokely Carmichael's telephone number, Amiri Baraka's, not telephone number, addresses, and I went to Washington, D.C. So the people that I admired, I began to meet them. But Black America is very complex at any time. But in the intellectual moment, I'm really making a big jump here. In the intellectual moment that we are in, we're moving toward things called appropriation, things called Black embodiment. It's a Black tribalism that's no different from white tribalism. That's no different from Indian tribalism or African tribalism, and I'm really worried about that. And I always discuss this with Angela. And some of these people are comrades, people we work with, but they are returning to this notion that they embody something special in Blackness, whether they're taking it into Afrofuturism or Afro-pessimism, the different iteration of this tribalism. And it really goes hand in hand with capitalism also. That is, they're entitled to this kind of position Angela was talking about, and yet they forget the revolution, you know. So, and Cedric Robinson is interesting. He gave me my first doctoral dissertation fellowship. So, you know, I still want to be Black American, by the way. So.
I think yesterday, Keeanga Taylor actually reflected on this, and also Russell, is that there is, of course, class element, and if you think intersectionally, of course, there is this, even among Black Americans, is that there is this kind of a new category of people. But of course, one of the things that one encounters in Black studies is sometimes manufactured conflicts, in a sense that between African American, and of course, the stereotype sometimes goes both ways. But my position has always been in that it is what Angela always espoused for, or actually advocate, which is this internationalism, cosmopolitanism. Because there is no really fixed notion of an African. If we have a Mandela and we have a Mobutu, so there's nothing really essential about that except the position that you take in terms of the struggle, the vision of how you really make allies, and it has to be definitely cosmopolitan and definitely build on a specific ideology that takes into account class, race, gender, all of those issues. And I think that's the biggest accomplishment of what one could learn from the experience of being in Black studies, is what it is that contributed, to really philosophy today, to modernity today, to analysis of capitalism. I mean, the interjection of race really has been an amazing, and it reached not only race, but also racial capitalism as a notion, which is, I think, maybe there is a need to have a whole conference to explain it, because a lot of people get confused about it, rejecting it, or thinking about and this is not about challenging Pramesh yesterday, is that no matter how the notion of work have changed, that element of race, or the analysis that's called racial capitalism, an element of it is, is still there. So I'm going to stop here, and I think it is important. Yeah, definitely. And I wanted to to engage all the audience, and I will try to identify them. But let me. Can you please give Beatrice? Yeah. And who else? Sorry. Okay, sure. Anybody else in the audience? So, okay. Two. Maybe.
Okay. I think this is now on. You can hear me? Yes. Manthia, since you mentioned me and you said that very important thing, that we are part of the problem that we are trying to solve, I should say that, of course, I was actually, when we were talking about that yesterday, I was talking about Fanon, that his model of, I wasn't really claiming that idea for myself, that his model of a colonial psychiatry, psychoanalysis, in Black Skins, of course, it's psychoanalysis, was actually to stage, this was very dangerous, and people still find it hard to read that book because it's so slippery, because it stages critique. And I said to you that one should read Fanon's actual dissertation and Black Skins together to see how he stages an analysis where he is, in fact, in the beginning of the book, part of the thing that he critiques. I also wanted to say that I really held my tongue yesterday, so I just will say what was in my mind yesterday as well, in response to you. You know that Angela and I go back a very long way indeed. And she's a bit younger than I. I've always been a little envious of that, but that's fine. We go back a long way. And if she could hear me, she would be laughing now. Because I always ask her, because of course, I grew up in an already existing socialist state within a central system that was not socialist, West Bengal, second international communism, intellectual communism, all problems, but nonetheless I grew up within that situation. So the last time that we spoke, she was performing for me at the MLA, right, last month. And we were talking about the culture of statelessness. I had requested her to think of the carceral population internationally as statelessness, rather than just Hannah Arendt's powerful definition of statelessness. And the question that I asked her at the end, she was powerful, she was fantastic. This is a magnificent sister. But I always ask the same question as an old Marxist. I said, how about not the tribalism inside, but how about the class structure of the possibility of international intersectionality? And I won't take very much longer, just one more thing. And so she said that, yes, that's something that should be brought up every time that this conversation takes place, because that is also a species of capitalist tribality, not just black. And the third thing that I'll say is, you were talking about being in the United States. I went in 1961. I was in the presence of Malcolm X. I saw Malcolm X. In 1962, he came to Cornell to debate James Brown, and I was in the third row. And I was 20 years old, and I felt that I was this was before Lyndon Johnson changed the Alien Registration Act. So we were within the kind of quota system that Trump was trying to bring back in, right? And so the India that I met at that point in the United States was the Beat Generation. I sang on the harmonium with Allen Ginsberg. That India was not my India. We were a very political group in Calcutta. And when Malcolm was a soft-spoken guy, when he started speaking, I thought, my God, this is my Calcutta. And then I was fortunate enough, because I was a member of Telluride, board scholarship, to be sitting at the same dinner table. Mind you, I didn't say anything to him. I was scared out of my head. And anyway, I was just a young foreign student female. But nonetheless, no good feminism at that point, no multiculturalism. And so I'm sitting there, Malcolm X and the guy who was then Leroy Jones, Adamov, same table. So this experience of the guy who was, and I live walking distance from the place where he was killed right now. I sit across from there and I think of that man, and what was he beginning to do through Islam? Critiquing the system of which he was a part, and black tribalism could not tolerate this. See, so therefore I just wanted to add these things so that we don't forget, when we think historically, that we should be thinking about these things as well, so that when we think about black tribalism, we go back, and the strongest black man who was against black tribalism, Lumumba, let's not forget him. He was killed by the Katangans, by black tribalists, and Hewlett-Packard. Today, if I were giving yet another talk, I would be showing the 19 videos that Hewlett-Packard has showcasing black African women so that they can't say anything against Hewlett-Packard. You know what I mean? Using black women from Africa. So I just wanted to get these few things said, Manthia, because you were kind enough to mention me a number of times. And finally, and this is final, I can see you looking at your watch. This is final. Of course, I think about other people, Sweetie. Believe me, I think about other people. I'm trying to say things that other people might not say. So therefore, the very last thing that I will say is, somebody asked a question yesterday about thinking about the future that I had spoken of, right? I kept myself, should I answer? No. Should I answer? No. But I would like to say to that brother, I don't know who he was, that it is necessary to think about the future that you were mentioning, that history makes an undecidable future. We cannot, in fact, we do not have the luxury of forgetting that the future is undecidable as we claim that we are creating communities. Thank you for letting me speak at length, Salah. Thank you very much.
So just allow me, because it's really haram, yani that we stop this discussion now. There are 2 or 3 people that we can take their comments. We don't have to answer, but I think it's important. There is time. There's almost 15 minutes. We can take 10 minutes, 5 minutes break, and then we go. I know there will be a session. Just please. Yes, yeah. We'll take 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, darling.
Yeah. You'll be after her.
Hi, my name is Pragya, Prague like the city with a ya. I feel really grateful to be here. I'm a kid, I'm 25. I was introduced to Angela Davis and your work last year when I was in New York, and I was right in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer. I was everywhere. The protests and all of that. So I'm very new to everything, but the one thing that I've struggled with, and the one thing that Angela mentioned right at the end, was how you cannot forget how the past produces the present. You cannot be so attached to the present that you forget how it produces the present, and how the present right now produces many possible futures. I'm a kid. I just learned how to be in the present. I have no idea of how to carry this on, how to find my place as a comrade in this movement, how to do the imaginings and the thinking of the future in the way that you all have done for us. But that's something that we'll have to carry with us as children, and I have no idea. I don't know how to do that work. I've read everything I could possibly read. But that's not where the work lies. That's me collecting all of the history. But what is the output that I can do? How do I do the work that you have all done for us? How do I carry it on? I would love to know. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Is there any other person? Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I have a brief comment and a brief question. The first comment is, I was struck by your approach to the interview. You kept your your questions short, and you really went to the basics. Freedom, feminism, and these, and I thought are very useful because we take some of these things for granted. So I'm very grateful that you had to elaborate on those terms. And the question has to do with documentary that you're going to make public soon. As a filmmaker and as a specific figure for who she is, she has a unique approach. Without asking you to tell us too much about the documentary, are there specific approaches that required you to capture the essence of your work?
Yes, I made a film called Edouard Glissant, One World in Relation. And in the making of the film, Glissant said, I don't want no biography, no autobiography, nothing. Just put the camera on me, put the camera on the water. And just to mark him, I did that. And I've made 15 films. It's my most famous film. You know, many of you don't know any of my other films, but you know the Glissant film. So I said to Angela, and I may knock on Gayatri's door on this, I want to do basic, simple films, simple technically speaking, to give the mic to these philosophers of our time and let them talk and cut away to somebody walking the dog, cut away to, I don't know, a tree or whatever, just like the Glissant film. That's the structure of the film. And that's what I'm doing. And I spent 1 week just talking to her. And so, yeah.
Thank you so much, Manthia. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to Angela for a wonderful conversation, you know, thought-provoking, enlightening, and a school, as you said, it's a schooling. Thanks a lot.